Out of all major sports, baseball has perhaps the richest history, the one whose fans most cling to tradition and are proud at just how little the game has changed over the years. It is, after all, a carefully constructed game with certain fixed constraints. 90 feet between bases, 3 strikes and you're out, 3 outs in a half inning, and a pitcher stands exactly 60 feet 6 inches from the batter. But not everything has remained the same over the years. A time traveler from today attending a game from a century ago would no doubt be able to follow the action just fine. But he would also notice something very strange. You see, in the early 1900s, Major League Baseball was known for its low-scoring games. And honestly, the offensive numbers couldn't have been any worse. Teams were averaging just 3.4 runs per game, and the league batting average was an unimpressive 239. Compare that with the 2023 Major League Baseball season, which comparatively had crazy offensive numbers.
On Soto. That is hit in the air to right and way out of here.
Teams averaged 4.62 runs per game, and the league batting average stood at 248. So why were the offensive numbers so bad back in the day? What exactly would stand out to our time traveler? The answer? Well, the baseball. Or, more precisely, the dead ball. It's the ball, stupid.
Yes, he went. Struck him out to end.
There's a good reason we now refer to the period of the early 20th century as the dead ball era of Major League Baseball. But let's go back further to baseball's origin story, to the first half of the 1800s. The ball that big leaguers used in 1845 was quite different than the balls today. While today's baseballs feature a rubber cork center wrapped in yarn and covered with natural horsehide, or sometimes synthetic leather, baseballs back then were very uninspiring. The very first baseballs were nothing more than melted rubber from old shoes, wrapped in yarn and leather, or, in some cases, sturgeon eyes. It was anything but perfect. And, well, most pitchers made their own baseballs. This, of course, meant that the league had a wide variety of baseballs, mainly because of the different materials used. And since the rules back then didn't give much attention to the baseballs themselves, everyone just kind of went with whatever was suitable to them. While some baseballs back then may have looked quite similar in appearance, they were actually quite different on the inside and on the surface of the leather wrapping. Perhaps one of the most popular balls of the early years was the lemon peel, which was basically a wound core wrapped in a single piece of leather and sealed with 4 unique stitching lines. The lemon peel got popularized due to its unique lemon-like appearance and a stitching pattern that was way before its time. But across the board, baseballs were actually kind of small, coming in at about 6 inches in circumference, and much lighter than today's baseballs. Plus, the game was a little different too. Runners could even be called out once they were soaked, which is merely a fancy term for getting hit with a baseball thrown by a fielder. These lighter baseballs before the 1850s were much livelier than the balls used today, leading to a scoreboard that looked somewhat like a basketball game. By the mid-1850s, baseball clubs in New York decided to put up some ball regulations, setting the weight between 5.5 and 6 ounces, with a circumference around 8 to 11 inches. The result was a larger, heavier, and, well, far less lively baseball. But still, it was the first step towards ball regulation. These widely accepted standards were adopted by most other teams, and remained relatively consistent throughout the 1850s and 1860s. However, the rules themselves were actually still pretty flexible. So of course, teams could tweak a couple of ball specifications, as long as they left the ball size about the same. One of the craftiest ways to improve ball performance was by manipulating the amount of rubber in the core. Another was to alter the ball's winding. While balls with less rubber in the core and a loose wind were dead balls. A tighter winding with more rubber in the core created a livelier ball, one that would travel much further when hit. While balls with less rubber in the core and a loose wind were dead balls. Home teams loved this variation, since ball selection was usually left up to the home team. Of course, this meant that visiting teams would often find that they were hitting dead balls and pitching live balls, a perfect situation for home advantage. But surely, there had to be a way to remove these ball irregularities and make the game much more consistent for everybody. Well, that's where the figure-8 stitching came in. While there's some debate as to who actually invented the idea, 2 people are traditionally credited with it. First, Ellis Drake, a shoemaker's son, who created the design using some of his father's scrap leather while trying to achieve a better baseball cover. Next is Colonel William Cutler, who invented the stitch and sold it to William Harwood, one of the first baseball manufacturers. Whether it was Drake or Cutler who first invented the figure-8 stitch, it was Harwood & Sons who popularized it as the first mass-produced baseball design. It solved a lot of the irregularities with the wide variety of baseballs, bringing relative consistency to the baseball for the very first time. Then came 1876, the year when the National League of Professional Baseball Clubs was formed. And with the new league came, yep, you guessed it, rules and regulations. But even with all the new regulations, there was still a certain problem. They had to pick a baseball. Just then, recently retired pitcher A.G. Spalding pitched a brilliant idea to the league. You see, Spalding played for the Boston Red Sox, and in the course of his career, he made his own baseballs whenever he pitched, which meant that he had a lot of knowledge on how to produce a baseball. Spalding had no trouble convincing the National League to adopt his baseball as the league's standard ball, and for good reason. The Spalding baseball had a standard weight and size very similar to today's baseball, which meant that the home advantage was greatly reduced. So we have a uniformly agreed to baseball that is well made for the very first time in baseball. The rest is history, right? Actually, this is only where things start to get interesting. The dead ball era. Spalding's baseballs marked the start of professional baseball. Most of the teams now played in the National League, and there couldn't have been a better time to become a baseball player. But then, it gets interesting from there. You see, despite the existence of a uniform ball across the league, there was still one small problem. Or you could actually call it a major problem, depending on how you see it. Compared to before, where baseball had a more free-scoring game, league runs started to plummet. And I'm talking really, really low. And, of course, it was the baseball. It was too soft and would become softer over the course of the game, leading to fewer big hits and unimpressive scores. This was dubbed the dead ball era of baseball. The dead ball was a major issue for the league at the time. So during the 1910 World Series, the league introduced a new baseball that had a core of cork instead of the more traditional rubber. Instantly, there was a massive boon in teams' offensive numbers. In 1911, there was an average of 4.51 runs and 0.21 home runs per game, which was a lot better than the 1910's average of 3.83 runs and 0.14 home runs per game. The exact opposite of the dead ball era happened right after the start of the 1920s, with further changes to Spalding's baseball. Seeing the offensive struggles of most baseball teams, an idea struck Spalding. How about changing the wool on the inside to allow for a more tightly wound ball? For this, Spalding went with Australian wool, as it was stronger, which allowed it to wind a lot tighter. Remember, a tighter wind makes a ball livelier. Well, Spalding was basically applying that principle. This new, more tightly wound ball was it. It was livelier than any of the baseballs of the last decades, and it showed in the numbers. An average of 5.13 runs and 0.48 home runs per game in 1925 should tell you just how much an improvement it was. Of course, a singular slugger named the Great Bambino had a lot to do with baseball's new power. Still, Babe Ruth aside, baseball soon found it had the opposite problem, a ball that was too lively. The rabbit ball. By the start of the 1930s, offensive numbers absolutely exploded. Sports writers at the time dubbed this the rabbit ball, or juiced ball, and soon teams started complaining. Pitchers generally couldn't even handle the rabbit ball, and the numbers backed this up, with an increase in the number of walks from an average of 2.7 in the 1920s to 3.0. Still, the league insisted this was due to the new rules put in place banning spitballs, and also the increase in the number of times the ball was changed in game. In the past, a ball could be used for an entire game, allowing it to get softer as the game went on. But with these new regulations, balls were changed more frequently, which benefited the hitters. Still, teams couldn't deal with it, and in 1930, further changes were made to the ball. This included a replacement of the cork center in favor of a cushioned cork pill, which was really a mixture of cork and ground rubber. The idea was pioneered by Milton Reach, and what followed was a decrease in scoring and home runs. Although the American and National Leagues used basically the same ball, there were still some slight differences up until 1934, when both leagues agreed to use a standardized baseball. This was also the first time the specific ingredients for a baseball were revealed. But even with such a highly descriptive cookbook, making a consistent baseball was so much harder in practice. But since 1934, baseballs have actually only gone through slight changes. Like during World War II, the government banned the use of rubber for non-war related goods, including baseballs. Manufacturers generally went with a rubber-like shell of balata, an alternative to rubber. However, they were back to using rubber in 1944 with the introduction of synthetic rubber. Additional minor changes happened in 1974 due to a shortage of horsehide, which was replaced by cowhide as the cover material. Perhaps the most significant change since 1934 came in 1976, when Major League Baseball switched manufacturers from Spalding to Rawlings, which is still the official manufacturer in Major League Baseball today. The last major change in a baseball was in 2021, when Rawlings altered their manufacturing to reduce the bounce in baseballs. If a time traveler from a century ago visited today's game, what would they observe? Well, today's baseballs have a typical cork core, with several layers of tightly wound yarn added to it. But what stands out most is the cover, which is 2 pieces of horsehide bound with figure-8 stitching. You're probably wondering what the difference is with the 1934 balls. Well, let's just say that today's baseballs come packed with tech, and balls are now stored under controlled temperatures and wound under constant tension. So nobody has to worry about soft spots in a baseball anymore. Of course, that doesn't stop pitchers from complaining that the ball is juiced, or hitters complaining that it's just not lively enough.